He sat there at the work party, music playing, glasses clinking, everyone laughing, and suddenly a thought hit him. Why am I here? For months, Dan's co-workers had been asking him to come out, and for months he kept saying no. He barely talked to them at work, and deep down, he knew they weren't really his kind of people. But this time, he gave in. Now he's standing there, watching them drink and gossip, and that same thought echoes louder. Why am I here? Someone shouts his name across the room.
Dan, come have a drink with
He
us.
smiles politely, shakes his head and says,
No.
That night, walking home, something clicks. It wasn't that he hated his co-workers. It was that he didn't want to live the way they did. He didn't want their conversations, their habits, their mindset. That night, Dan stopped trying to fit in and started to understand himself. This is the psychology of the deep thinker. That night, Dan didn't just walk home, he walked inward. Something in him had shifted. For the first time, he felt the faint pull of a deeper current, one that didn't care about small talk or parties or appearances. It cared about truth, about authenticity, about meaning. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Most people spend their lives trying to become what others expect, but the deep thinker begins when that spell breaks, when imitation turns to introspection. The next morning, Dan woke up different. He couldn't explain it, but the noise of the world seemed duller and the quiet inside him louder. He poured his coffee, sat by the window, and simply watched. Watched the steam rise. Watched his thoughts float by. For the first time, he wasn't in a rush to fill the silence. He was starting to understand that silence was not emptiness. It was space. Space where something real could finally speak. Jung called this first awakening the moment the persona cracks. The persona is the mask we wear to fit into the world. Polite, efficient, acceptable. But deep beneath that mask, another voice whispers, "This isn't all of me." When that voice grows strong enough to be heard, you can't go back. You can pretend for a while, but pretending begins to hurt. The soul resists, and the more you ignore it, the louder it becomes. Most people silence that voice. They drown it in busyness, in gossip, in screens, in noise. But the deep thinker, the one who cannot look away, eventually answers the call. Jung called that call the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of aligning the outer life with the inner truth. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming real. For Dan, it started simply. He began saying no more often, not out of rebellion but out of respect for himself. He stopped forcing laughter where there was no joy, stopped chasing approval he didn't need. And with every quiet refusal, something inside him straightened. This is the paradox of the deep thinker. The more you step away from the crowd, the closer you move toward the self. Jung believed that within every human lies a deeper center, an organizing principle he called the self. It's not the ego. The ego says, "I am what I do." The self says, "I am what I am becoming." The self doesn't shout, it guides. It whispers through dreams, through intuition, through moments of stillness that seem to come from nowhere. At first, Dan ignored those whispers. but slowly they became too clear to dismiss. When he walked, ideas came to him, not random thoughts, but insights, as if someone wiser was speaking softly in his mind. He began writing them down, not to publish, but to listen. In those pages, he started seeing patterns, themes of freedom, authenticity, simplicity. He realized that what he longed for wasn't escape, but essence. He didn't want more, he wanted meaning. Jung would say that Dan's unconscious was beginning to speak, and when the unconscious begins to speak, your life becomes a dialogue between two worlds, the seen and the unseen. Most people live only in the outer world. The deep thinker learns to live in both, but that dual vision comes with a price. Because when you start to look inward, you will meet something most people spend their lives avoiding. The shadow is everything you've rejected about yourself. All the anger, envy, fear, pride, or weakness that you've buried beneath your persona. It is the part that whispers, "Don't look here." And yet, that is exactly where the treasure lies. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's the deep thinker's real courage, not brilliance, but honesty. Dan started to see his shadow in small ways. His irritation at co-workers, his judgment toward others who seemed superficial. At first, he told himself he was simply different, but slowly he saw that what annoyed him in others was what he denied in himself. He wanted to be above the crowd, but that desire to be above was pride, wearing a wise mask. When he saw that clearly, something in him softened. The irritation turned into understanding. The judgment turned into curiosity. He began to ask, "What is this reaction trying to show me about myself?" And each time, he found a fragment of truth waiting in the dark. That's how shadow work begins. Not with perfection, but with perception. You learn to see yourself whole, light and dark, noble and flawed, and to accept it all as part of you. The deep thinker doesn't strive to be pure. He strives to be complete. As his inner world grew richer, Dan began craving solitude. Not escape, solitude. There's a difference. Escape runs from life. Solitude listens to it. He spent weekends walking without music, letting his thoughts settle like dust in sunlight. At first it felt uncomfortable. The silence exposed everything he had avoided. But over time, silence became his teacher. Jung wrote that only in solitude can we hear the whispers of the self. The mind, like a lake, must grow still before it can reflect the sky. In that stillness, Dan's creativity returned. He started writing short reflections, not for an audience, but as dialogue with the unseen. Each sentence felt like a handshake with the eternal. The deep thinker learns that solitude is not loneliness, it is communion with the parts of you that the noise of the world cannot reach. Dan still went to work, still spoke to his colleagues, but the need to impress had vanished. He no longer chased connection, he created it by presence alone. When people spoke, he listened, not to reply, but to understand. And in that attention, others felt seen. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Dan had become catalytic, not through words, but through being. He learned that community without conformity is possible, that solitude and connection aren't opposites, but extensions of one another. Because when you know yourself, you can finally meet others as equals, not as mirrors. Deep thinking is not an intellectual hobby, it's a daily practice. A way of being that honors both thought and feeling, both reason and intuition. Dan's mornings changed. He would wake before sunrise, sit quietly, and ask one question: what wants to be lived through me today? Then he would listen, not for an answer in words, but for a sense, a direction, a pulse. Some days it led him to create, some days to rest, some days to confront a fear he'd avoided. Each act, however small, became a thread in the tapestry of his becoming. That's the secret Jung discovered. Transformation doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in thousands of quiet choices. Each time you choose awareness over avoidance, truth over pretense, courage over comfort, you move closer to wholeness. The deep thinker doesn't live above life. He lives more deeply within it. He laughs, he struggles, he doubts, but he remains awake through it all. He sees the patterns that repeat, the shadow returning for another lesson, the anima asking for more tenderness, the trickster showing up to break his certainty. And instead of fighting these returns, he welcomes them, because he knows that growth is circular, not linear. Every descent into darkness is followed by renewal. Every loss hides a seed. Every ending conceals a beginning. Jung described this as the spiral of individuation, a continuous dance between consciousness and the unconscious. Each cycle brings you closer to the center, to that inner mandala where all opposites meet. Dan felt this one evening as he looked out his window. The city lights flickered like stars, and for a moment he sensed no division between himself and the world. Just presence, just being. He smiled, not because everything made sense, but because everything finally felt real. To think deeply is not to overthink. It's to feel thought as a living force, to let it move through your entire being until it becomes wisdom. The deep thinker doesn't chase meaning, he cultivates it. He plants questions and lets time water them. He trusts that understanding ripens in silence. He doesn't fear contradiction because he knows truth often wears two faces. He doesn't fear change because he knows growth demands it. And he doesn't fear solitude because he's learned that every honest conversation with himself brings him closer to the world. Dan once thought deep thinking was about intellect. Now he sees it's about integration, the marriage of mind and soul. That's why Jung's psychology still speaks today. It's not a theory, it's a mirror. It reflects the parts of you waiting to be known. When you study Jung, you don't just learn about archetypes, you meet them, you live them. You realize that the myths of gods and heroes are simply coded stories of your own inner journey. You are the hero who must venture into the unconscious, the trickster who must learn humility, the lover who must open to vulnerability, the sage who must surrender control. And you are the self, calling you home through them all. Because the world doesn't need more people who fit in, it needs more people who have found themselves. That is the psychology of the deep thinker. Carl Jung showed the way. Now it's your turn to walk it. And maybe one day someone will look at you, calm, grounded, alive, and wonder how you became that way. And you'll smile because you'll know the secret. You didn't become someone else. You finally became yourself.